So we're back in our This Jesus series that we were looking at Jesus throughout the scriptures, and we took a bit of a break. So the first unit, if you like, of what we've looked at was all based on the historical prophetic books and the law, and so now we come to the prophets. And the first prophet is Isaiah, but this morning I want to do a bit of introduction and background to how to approach the prophets, because I think we can get very lost if we're not careful in amongst the prophets. I think the issue for me is that often there are quotes from those prophetic books and they get very easily taken out of context. We very easily interpret some of those texts and put them in the wrong time frame, about the wrong people. And they do demonstrate the nature of God, and there's nothing wrong with seeing the nature of God in those, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to read scripture for things that it didn't mean. I mean, that's the bottom line. So I want us to this morning to try and get a grasp of, to understand the significance and the purpose of the prophets in the whole biblical storyline. Because I think we can often think, well, there's a story, that's the history, and then we jump to Matthew. But actually, the prophets, which is a huge section of books, are all part of that storyline. And so I want to just sort of get a little bit of a handle on that. Clearly, we're not going to go into detail with all these prophetic books, or we'd be here for another few years. I'm going to do Isaiah in this week and next week, okay? So, and as you know, it's a long book of 60-odd books, so 60-odd chapters. But I think to understand the biblical storyline and the place of the prophetic books in that, we need to answer certain questions. So who were these prophets? When did they live? What was going on in Israel at the time? And how does any of this relate to the coming Messiah and the eternal purposes of God? How does it fit? We all know that there are verses, particularly in Isaiah, that speak of Jesus. We all know that's there. We quote them often. But why are they there? How do they get there? What's the context in which they're written? So that's what I want to do this morning. It would help if I had my clicker on. And to be quite honest, the books of the Hebrew prophets are some of the most challenging books of the Bible to read. But they're actually also some of the most beautiful books to read. But learning to read them can take an effort. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that will have not gone into a lot of the prophetic scriptures unless I'm sort of made to go there because we're looking at it particularly. I mean, let's think about Malachi, which we looked at as Bible study. How many of us have really looked at Malachi until we said, let's do it in a Bible study? And yet, as we went through it, we realised the significance of it to our life. So I think it is worth it. But I think if you find them challenging, you're in good company. Just got a couple of quotes here. The first is from Martin Luther. Now, I love this because this is such a German statement about the prophets. So Martin Luther said, the prophets have an odd way of talking, like people who, instead of proceeding in an orderly manner, ramble off from one thing to the next, so that you cannot make heed or tail of them or see what they are getting at. And I love that, having worked with some Germans over the years. Everything has to be in a very orderly manner. That's the way the German psyche works. So, the prophets are a real challenge to Martin Luther. But this quote from one of the Bible commentaries: what makes the prophetic books particularly, and one might say needlessly difficult, is the very manner of their arrangement, or, to be more accurate, their apparent lack of arrangement. All seems confusion. The impression the reader gains is one of extreme disarray. One can scarcely blame him for concluding that he is reading a hopeless hodgepodge thrown together without any discernible principle of arrangement at all. And that's why when you read the prophets, you can read one verse, then read the next verse, and well, how do they relate to each other? Or you can read a bit of history in there, and then comes this whole poem, if you like, and it's like, well, where do they relate? Just going to try and unpack that a little bit for us this morning before we actually get into Isaiah. And the first thing to say is that biblical prophecy isn't the prediction of future events. But that's what most of us understand the term prophecy as, just that. We think that prophecy is all about predicting what's going to happen. And that isn't the nature of biblical prophecy. That definition is inadequate, and it doesn't actually account for huge amounts of the material in the prophetic books. Because although there are certain passages in the prophets that do contain predictive, if you like, elements, speaking of things that we later see come to pass, most of the poems and the narratives actually don't present themselves as predictive prophecy. They don't say, thus says the Lord, this will happen. Right? It isn't the nature of them. We need to understand that in the Bible, a prophecy, and I think this is the right definition of prophecy in general, is a message that God speaks to his people through a human prophet, through someone who hears his voice. Therefore, prophecies often contain the quoted speech of God himself, but not just that. In other words, a prophet is someone who hears from God and shares it. Now, some people do that a lot, and that we sort of identify them as, these are people who are really prophetic. They hear a lot from God. But to a certain extent, bringing a message on a Sunday morning is prophetic. Yeah. It's speaking what God has said. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be something new that's God said. As we will see with the prophets, they are very much based on what has been said and what that means for what is to come. And so therefore we need to just change our little mindset of prophecy, because we've grown up in a time frame in the church where prophecy has become very much about saying what's going to happen, and that isn't the biblical nature of prophecy. Prophecy is about declaring what God has on his heart. So these prophets, and where they're placed in our Bible is really helpful. They're actually a bridge between the past story of Israel and the covenant and the future story of God's rescue plan for the world through Jesus. So what we're going to look at as we look at the prophets is this bridge between where we've been and all that God has said to his people and done with his people and promised to his people, and how that is going to then be seen in Jesus. And the prophets give us that bridge, if you like. It's interesting that the prophetic books take up as much page space in the Bible as the entire New Testament. Now, we'll all commit to reading the New Testament, but committing to reading all those prophets feels like a much bigger job. And yet it's the same amount. And also, as I think we're very aware, in the New Testament itself, Jesus and the apostles constantly quoted the prophets to explain how Jesus was bringing Israel's story to its fulfillment. In other words, these prophetic scriptures, however they came about, and we're going to look at that, ended up giving us things that when Jesus came, he could say, this is that. Yeah. And the apostles could say, this is that. Yeah. And we, if we get to know these prophetic scriptures, we'll be able to say, this is that. They're quoted, the prophets are quoted 77 times in the Gospels and 98 times in the rest of the New Testament. That's an awful lot of quotes from books that we maybe don't spend a lot of time in. So we're going to spend some time in them. So what about these prophets? Who were they? Well, for every significant king in Israel's history, there was always a prophet alongside. Kings and prophets go together. Now, Jesus, of course, was both. But alongside a king, God would place a prophet. And 12 of the 15 prophetic books that we're going to look at, actually I think it might be more than 15, I need to check, they actually begin with a historical note. They begin by telling us when the prophet lived and the kings that they held accountable. That's why it's in the year of king this or at the time of king that. In other words, this prophet is speaking into this king's rule and reign. And so it's actually worth, as you read the prophets, you need to keep going back to the books of Samuel through to Kings to put it in context, and particularly Kings. We must, as we're reading it, remember what context this prophet is speaking into. Now, just another helpful thing to remember about kings in Israel, because kings in Israel were not like kings in Egypt, for instance. Egyptian kings were considered divine. gods in their own right. But Israelite kings were viewed as humans who were subject to the law of God's covenant. And prophets were there to help keep the Israelite kings accountable to God. That was their role. And that is still, I think, the role of a prophet, to keep God's people accountable to what is on God's heart. And if you begin to see that as a role of a prophet, you begin to see how significant and how important it is that we have prophetic giftings amongst us that say, hang on, but this is what God has said. This is what's on God's heart. How does that line up? And actually, if you start to hear prophetic words that don't line up with God's heart, then they're not prophets and it's not prophetic. Okay, so that's a bit of a background. What are the books? What are we talking about when we're talking about the prophetic books? Okay, so the prophetic books are made up of 5 major prophetic books and 12 minor prophetic books. So you'll hear people talk about the major prophets and the minor prophets. And those books are collections of narratives and poems and essays that represent the message of the Israelite prophets. Now, they didn't write them down as they brought them. These prophetic books were crafted over a long period of time by the scholars of the Hebrew scholars. Probably a lot of them during the time of exile and obviously on return. And what they did was they took all the bits and they tried to put them into some sort of order. But actually put in a bit of storytelling and put in a bit of history and then put in a explanation and then put in some poems together. You know, if we know prophetic people, we have prophetic people amongst us. You try making sense of all those things they've said and putting them in some order. We know how difficult that's going to be, all right? So we need to recognise that that's the nature of these books. They are not like the books we've been looking at previously, where they're written in some sort of chronological order to tell us a story. They're the heart of God, but they are in a particular historical context. And many of those books actually begin with editorial instructions that probably weren't written by the prophet, were written by the people who put it together. So they tell us that, you know, making sure we understand the context of when this guy was saying all this stuff, okay? Daniel's a really good example of that. We all know that Daniel is sort of half history and half prophecy. The half history is the bit we all know, the stories. The half prophecy is the bit, well, this bunch of us here know, but a lot of the church doesn't even read. Because they get to that bit and they're like, well, how does that fit with that? I don't get that at all. Of course it does, and when we come to Daniel, we'll see that. And most of those prophetic books, they're relating to the full narrative of what has come before, of Genesis to 2 Kings and Ezra and Nehemiah. They're relating to that whole storyline within the context of their particular time frame. You see, what we have to remember is that Israel is walking with a covenant and many promises. And they're the context for what these prophets are coming to speak about. And when we look at the prophecies, there's sort of 3 particular themes, if you like, that they fit with. First of all, we will find in the prophets there's a lot of accusation, right? Accusations that Israel and the nations have rebelled against Yahweh. Israel and Judah have broken the covenant, they've worshipped other gods, they've allowed social injustice, and they've made alliances with the foreign nations. So when we studied Malachi, we saw the accusations that were being brought by God against the priests, against the leadership. And the same is true in all of the prophets. You will find accusation. This is what God is saying about the state you've got into. That's always followed by calls for repentance and these admonitions to turn from those wicked ways and return to faithful obedience to Yahweh. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, yes. And that includes calls for religious devotion to Yahweh alone and no other gods. At the heart of the prophets is this call back to one God, the God Yahweh, the one who has chosen them, has made a covenant with them. And that call is also for social justice and care for the most vulnerable people, such as the widows, the orphans and the immigrants. And that's why in the prayer room we often will go to the prophets to pray, because if we're praying for the oppressed and the downtrodden, and those who are in darkness, we often go to some of those verses of the calls for repentance and turning back that are in those scriptures. And we also go to what is the third part of the prophetic scriptures. That's the announcements of the day of Yahweh. That day which will address injustice and rebellion, when God will move to put it right. And that within the prophetic scriptures refers to both historical events that God will use to judge evil and vindicate the righteous, in particular the exile, which is where we're going to come and see very clearly shortly. But it's also all leading up to the great future day when God will do this for all creation, when he will reconcile all things in heaven and on earth, as we were thinking about. So it's the announcement of the day of Yahweh has historical fulfillment and also future fulfillment. And that's another reason why we tend to go into the scriptures, because with our New Testament framework, we can look back and see how some of that's going to be fulfilled. And each prophetic book has a unique design, and it has an organised flow of thought, but it's not chronological, which is what makes it difficult. So reading the prophets, if you like, it's a lot like listening. I was trying to think what it's like. Well, it's a bit like listening to a symphony or a concept album. If you ever, Moody Blues had concept albums, yeah? There was a theme that was in there, but each one was a different little picture in it, yeah? A symphony usually has an overarching focus, but you hear different bits of it at different times. That's what the prophets are like. If you like to think of it as a concept album, there's an overarching theme. There is a chronological flow, but it's not presented in that way. You just keep seeing different facets of it. There is always an opening introduction to all the main themes, so you can get a handle on it if you read the first chapter or two, but then it's broken up into multiple movements or sections, so bits of narrative and bits of poetry. But if you pay attention, you can hear those key themes being repeated and developed as you read through, and you begin to see how it can fit together. And one of the key themes that you will see through all of the prophets is the coming Messiah, which, as we know, is Jesus. Okay, so let's take hold. So that's sort of how to read it and understand it. What is the historical context of the biblical prophets? Well, most of them speak into the story that is in 2 Kings 17 to 25, which tells of the downfall of the northern kingdom of Israel to the Assyrians in 722 BC, and is followed by the demise of the southern kingdom of Judah to the Babylonians in 586 BC. I think we all know that. We've talked about it a lot. We all know the northern kingdoms, the 10 tribes of the north, taken by the Assyrians into exile, scattered by the Assyrians rather than taken actually, scattered into exile. And then the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin. Yes, Judah and Benjamin, isn't it? Yeah, the southern kingdoms of Judah and Benjamin, known mostly as Judah, then taken into Babylon. And that's when Daniel and the guys go into Babylon. So they're speaking into that time. Now, as we mentioned, the purpose of the prophets was to speak into God, what God was doing at particular times of Israel's history. Now, for us, as followers of Jesus, the story of his life, death and resurrection is the absolute centre of who we are. It's where we centre our practice, our belief, and our worldview radiates out from that central core of the life of Jesus. It's the centre event which generated the whole Christian story and generated the New Testament. But what we need to remember is those things didn't happen in a vacuum. Jesus didn't come to start something new. Jesus came in to fulfill a larger storyline that was already in his Bible, the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. And the core point where we've got that life of Jesus that says the centre point that he is working from is this time of the exile. One of the most important events in Jesus' Bible, which changed Jewish history forever. So as the coming of Jesus changed the lives of those who recognized him forever, so the exile into Babylon changed Israel's history forever. It's an event that left its mark on Israelite history in an unparalleled manner and played a key role in the formation of the Bible itself. For the Israelites, the exile was the watershed moment of their history, through which the entire Bible gains its significance. Everything else orbits around the gravity of this faith-shaking moment, when God allowed the people he had given a promise to lose the promise. It was into this period in Israel's history that the prophets spoke, and they brought God's perspective to the people. You see, when it looks like God's let you down, when God's turned his back on you, when God's not going to fulfill what he said, you need prophets to speak the truth of what God is actually doing, to see it through God's eyes. And that's why we're all called to be prophetic. We're all called to seek the face of God and to know his ways. And so what are those books? Well, the longer books, known as the major prophets, due to the next day works, that's Isaiah, Jeremiah, which includes Lamentations as part of Jeremiah, if you like. It's sort of an extra to Jeremiah, but it's within that same context. Ezekiel and Daniel, they're the big ones. And then the shorter ones are all those little books that we can never find. They're Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah and Malachi. Right? Now, in the coming weeks, we will definitely look at the majors. And I might look, and I think probably I'm just going to overview the minors rather than do them book by book, because otherwise we could be here for another year. Well, does it matter if we are, but you know. And because there's so much overlap, because they were written around the same time, there's overlaps as well. But within the major prophets, there's some key pictures that we want to get hold of. The thing about these books is they give us some of the richest glimpses and foreshadowing of Christ that we see in the entire Old Testament. If you want to know who Jesus is from the Old Testament, this is the place to go. And they're there to show God's people his eternal purpose in their exile and the future hope of a coming Messiah. It's out of the exile that hope gets spoken and Messiah begins to be spoken of. God spoke of him back in Genesis when he spoke about a seed that would crush. And we get little signs of a seed that's coming, but the prophets are the ones who nail it, who say this is what it's going to be like. So let's look at our first prophet. Let's have a look at Isaiah. It's the first of the prophetic books, and it actually takes us back to the decade before the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom. So this is before those 10 tribes in the north are taken. In other words, it's on this massive event is on the horizon, and Isaiah is the prophet who's given insight to it coming. He lives in Jerusalem, in southern Judea. So he's not in the northern kingdom. He's in Jerusalem, in Judea. And he can see the gathering Assyrian storm on the horizon. Now, what I want to say here is that doesn't mean he saw something, supernaturally crazy. No. He saw what was going on, and he had the wisdom and revelation from God to understand what was happening. Now, that's what we are seeking all the time. To be able to see what's going on, but to see it, we were talking about on Friday, weren't we? See it from heaven's perspective, not the world's perspective. And he's convinced that the northern kingdom of Israel's done for. But he still has hope that things could turn out differently for Judah and the family of David ruling in Jerusalem. So he's coming with, you can see this is going to happen in the north. You need to do something in the south so that it doesn't happen to you as well. Now, as we've seen from our studies of the historical books of the Old Testament, God chose Abraham after the scattering of Babylon and promised to make him into a large nation that would mediate divine blessing to all the nations. Remember, that's the history that the people that Isaiah is talking to are in. They are this people that God promised a divine blessing too. He promised that out of Abraham, this family would grow, and it did. It ended up in slavery in Egypt, and then it was rescued out of slavery and brought to the foot of Mount Sinai. There at that mountain, God asked the Israelites to obey all the terms of the covenant so that they could be God's priestly representatives to all the nations. This was God's purpose for Israel, that she would put him on display to all the nations. But we know, as the story goes on, the family of Abraham fail at the task. So we know God raised up David as a royal leader who will be faithful on behalf of the unfaithful people. So he establishes a king who will stand in the place for the people. It's actually a priest king because he stands in the place. But even that leader had his failures. We know that. David weren't that brilliant. Adultery and murder are not the easiest things to ignore, are they? So God promised that he would raise up an ideal leader for Israel who would come in the future from David's line. Now in 2 Samuel 7, God promised that a faithful king would arise and lead Israel towards faithfulness, and that this king would rule over the nations forever and ever. So Israel are looking for that king. Now David himself wasn't that king, neither was his son, and nor were any of his descendants for that matter. And because of this, when we open the book of Isaiah, we're anticipating this promised king from the line of David. That's where we are in the storyline. Where is this king? It's been promised, he still hasn't come. Where is this king who will fulfill the ancient promises of God to Abraham, to Israel and David? And actually, Isaiah doesn't disappoint, because actually one of the main themes of this book is the future hope of this anticipated king. The king who will fulfill the promise that has been made, who will be of the line of David. You see, that's what we have to realise. He's not just forth-telling some king that's to come. He's actually put in the context of the storyline. He's talking about this king, this future hope that is being waited for. And so in chapter 1, we learn that the Davidic rulers in Jerusalem have become murderers and thieves. But God promised he would purify Israel with a coming act of divine justice, and only the repentant would be redeemed. So that's the opening part of Isaiah. You, the kings, are corrupt, and God's going to come with divine justice, but if you repent in that, you will be redeemed. It's the gospel message. Now, in this, he was referring to the Assyrian Empire gathering just over the horizon, taking out those northern cities everywhere. But at this point, Isaiah trusted God's ancient promise to David. He knew that this act of judgment would not be God's final word. And if you read through chapter 1, we can't read chapter upon chapter, obviously, but if you read through chapter 1, there's all the gloom of what is happening, and then suddenly comes this verse in the midst of it all, when Isaiah says, and he's quoting God, "And I will restore your judges as at the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. Afterwards you shall be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city." Right at the beginning, Isaiah makes it clear, yes, this is looking awful, but this is God's promise. Afterwards, Jerusalem, you shall be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. The city that at the moment is just in disarray. Now we know that God allows the southern kingdom and the family of David to go through the fire and come out the other side purged and faithful. But the ultimate goal isn't just to glorify Israel. Now, when you read the prophets, if your Bible has actually recorded them as they were originally, you will often come to bits of poetry, which are laid out as poems. And in your notes, I've transferred them into text because otherwise you'd have too many bits of paper. But on the screen, I am going to put them up as poetry because I think we need to recognise that they are presented in poetry. And poetry often speaks the heart of God. because poetry is something that comes from heart. Do you remember we've talked about Song of Solomon and the importance of it, because it it doesn't express fact, it expresses how someone feels. So we read this at the beginning of chapter 2. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So chapter 1's about Assyria, about the Assyrian invasion to the north. Now, chapter 2, this is Isaiah speaking to the southern kingdoms of Judah and Benjamin, Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and he shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Isaiah brings the promise of what is possible for Jerusalem. Now, we know those verses because we now know, because of history, that we're still waiting for that king to come and do that. We know he's come and he's yet to come. But it's that picture of what Jerusalem is to be and will be that the rest of Isaiah picks up and develops. It's the storyline introducing new twists all along the way about how that is going to come to pass. And so the poems and the narratives in Isaiah that follow show how Assyria came to town and ruined much of the southern kingdom. And Isaiah confronted one Davidic king, Ahaz, who ended up being as faithless as his ancestors. So it's Ahaz that Isaiah addresses. And so Isaiah looked forward to a king who would be like David, have radical faith to save Israel from the Assyrian threat. And so all the way through here, Isaiah's looking for this king who will have the faith and the trust in God to stand against that which is coming and see Jerusalem and Judah become what she has been promised she will be. And it's this king, this coming king, that he describes in Isaiah 9, which we know. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations, the northern kingdoms. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Now that's the people he's talking about. These people who are being taken into exile, who have abandoned their God. That's the people who walked in darkness, have seen a great light. But they haven't yet. He's speaking it in the present, speaking of the future, because when is that future? Isaiah doesn't know. He just knows there's a promise. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian, in other words, when they came out of Egypt. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood, will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. See the context of those verses? And the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. In the midst of exile coming and everything in disarray, Isaiah brings a promise from God of what will be a future king who will establish all that God has promised. Now, you're not sitting in the 21st century as you're reading this. You're sitting back in the midst of all that. Imagine what that means to you. What are you constantly going to be looking for? Which king? Which king? When's he coming? You know, and so just as a title for the next section, would the real king from the line of David please stand up? You know? Because it's quite a king. I mean, there's no one been like that in the past. He's given some extremely exalted titles. It's actually called Mighty God. A king, Eternal Father, and of course famously Prince of Peace. That's where that phrase gets introduced. It's clear that when this king arrives, he's going to be the embodiment of the power and the presence of God, of the God of Israel. And he's going to bring about the fulfillment of God's promises to David. Now, as we read on, you realise that for Isaiah, this coming king will not just provide a solution to the immediate threat of the Assyrians, but his arrival will bring about a renewal of creation itself. So there's another poem in Isaiah 11 that describes this king as the shoot from the stump of Jesse. Now, Jesse's King David's father. So here we see again that this is talking about Judah. It was David's family who was threatened by the Assyrians and would later be taken captive to Babylon, effectively cutting off hope for the future because it was the line of David that was taken into Babylon. Now, once you're in Babylon and Jerusalem's fallen, what do you do with all these promises? But no matter how things get, God promises that a new David will grow out of Jesse's family line. And this king is amazing. He's actually endowed with the sevenfold Spirit of God, which empowers him to rule Israel and all nations and bring about perfect justice. So in Isaiah 11 we read, and lots of these passages can be familiar because we are familiar with them, because we know who they speak of. And this is where we find Jesus in Isaiah. Isaiah 11, verses 2 and 3. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. In other words, he'll have God's wisdom. Of course, that Spirit is promised to us as well. I don't think we'll ever know it in the measure that Jesus does, in total unity, but not only that, creation itself is going to undergo a transformation, which is what we were saying earlier on. So we have later in Isaiah 11, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Now this is poetry written by Isaiah in the context of what Isaiah knew. This is not prophecy that we're actually going to see a wolf living with a lamb, or we're actually going to see a child pick up a cobra, all right? This is a way of expressing the total peace and unity and reconciliation that we were talking about earlier of all of creation. It poetically depicts, by showing the most violent creatures of their imagination, like lions, bears, wolves and cobras, playing and snuggling with the weakest and most vulnerable creatures they could think of, lambs, calves, and baby humans. The king who brings about this transformation is going to become that rallying point for all of the nations. So verse 10 goes on to say, in that day the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. These are beautiful promises of what we are still waiting for that king. He has been revealed, but the promises in the first half of Isaiah are all about the fullness of that king. So with all of this hope, we then venture into the rest of Isaiah looking for, who is this king? Who will it be? Isaiah, who is this? This is something much more than we've ever thought of before. We thought of, good kings, but ones who are an everlasting God, ones who can cause wild animals to be safe around children. Well, who is this? Well, let's go back to the history, because the next Davidic king we meet is named Hezekiah. And Isaiah then goes on to tell his story in chapters 36 to 39. So with all these prophetic poems and things, and we go through the history, and then we get this bit of historical narrative in chapters 36 to 39. He's the king who's actually ruling at Jerusalem when the Assyrian war machine arrived. So it swept through the northern kingdoms, and now it's come to Jerusalem. And his response, Hezekiah's response, is completely opposite to Ahaz, his father, who was the one who had failed back in Isaiah 7. Hezekiah heads right into the temple and prays that the God of Israel would deliver him. And that's exactly what happens. He goes and prays, and God delivers. That night, a mysterious plague spreads throughout the Assyrian camp outside the city. Hezekiah wakes up and looks out on the corpses of thousands of Assyrian soldiers surrounding the city. And the king of Assyria retreats. Oh, Hezekiah, maybe he's that king. He prayed and God moved. That's what we're left thinking. Is he the one? Surely he's this Prince of Peace, the shoot from the stump of Jesse. But as always, in the Bible, the following story throws a wrench into that possible depiction of Hezekiah. Isaiah 39 tells a story about a group of Babylonian ambassadors. So now Assyrians are gone, now our Babylonians come to Jerusalem, and they come to court Hezekiah. And then we have to go back to 2 Kings 18-25, because we know that the Babylonians, Assyria's neighbours, were secretly plotting to topple the Assyrian Empire. So when God removes the Assyrians from Jerusalem, down come the Babylonians. They're looking to form alliances against the Assyrians, and clearly Jerusalem is against the Assyrians, so they want to form an alliance with Hezekiah. And the foolishness of man reveals itself again, because Hezekiah gets flattered by that. Hezekiah didn't drive back the Assyrians. God wiped them out. But he's flattered by that. He shows them all of his treasury and his resources. He's relied upon God of Israel in the moment of crisis, but once a better political option shows up, Hezekiah gives up. He crumbles. The possibility of having Babylonian military firepower in his pocket was more attractive than going through another Assyrian crisis on his knees in prayer. Here's a way of keeping them at bay. But of course it backfires, because actually it's the Babylonians that then destroy Jerusalem. But in chapter 39, Isaiah actually confronts Hezekiah and tells him there will be serious consequences for this faithless act. You've now trusted man instead of God. There's going to be consequence. And of course that consequence is the Babylonians, because they turn on him just a few generations later, and they actually become Jerusalem's destroyer, take nearly all of the population into Babylon as captive, and that's the great exile that we're very familiar with from the story in 2 Kings. And so Isaiah's warning, which is God's warning, does come true. And so that's where we're at halfway through Isaiah. Isaiah is very much seen in 2 halves. The first half of Isaiah is all those warnings and promises of hope, but actually comes to a grinding depression in chapter 39 as Israel goes into exile. All our hopes have been worked up. We thought Hezekiah was the promised king. He fails too, just like the others. And those divine promises of a future king from earlier in the book are left hanging open and unfulfilled. And so the author Isaiah wants us to see that the hope for a faithful king who would bring the kingdom of God has deep roots going all the way back to David. That's what he wants us to see. And it appears that this promise actually stood as a potential reality. I mean, if Hezekiah hadn't given in to the Babylonians and had continued to be on his knees before God, there is that potential. But of course we know that all men are fallen and all men will sin and all men will fall. But the point is that what's being set up through the prophecies of Isaiah is this continual future possibility. And every time someone sins and is selfish, they get disqualified from that. But there is that potential every time in a king from the line of David. But those future promises just keep getting delayed and kicked out into the distant future. And oh boy, did it end up being a distant future. But what I want us to understand, this is a very different concept of messianic prophecy than the popular conception of the prophets like Nostradamus, who looked into a crystal ball and predicted events far removed from their own day. What the prophets in the Old Testament and what biblical prophecy is always, it's always based on past promise. It's always based on the promises of God. It isn't some crazy, oh look, that's going to happen out there. It's actually, oh, this is how God is going to do that. And we need to get hold of that. And we need to get hold of it in our day, because that's how we can judge prophecy. Is it actually speaking of the fulfillment and how God's going to fulfill what he's already promised? Or is it telling us something completely different, in which case it isn't biblical prophecy? You see, they looked to God's promises in the past, to Abraham and David, to generate hope for their own day and beyond. The prophets believed that God's covenant promises called every generation of Israel and its kings to repentance and faithfulness. But as the story turns out, none of David's descendants lived up to this call. And then the exile happened. And this is how the promise of the Messiah became a hope for the distant future once the kingdom of David was hauled off to Babylon. And it's in that time in Babylon that those promises, I mean, we all know by the rivers of Babylon, yeah? We heard it sung by Boney M for many back in our history. It's that hope that Isaiah brought that they had to hang on to. And it was that storyline that Jesus was born into. And so the basic claim of the four gospel stories in the New Testament is that Jesus was that faithful king from the line of David. It's in this context that Jesus comes and fulfills. He was the one to whom this entire story had been pointing all along. Not because of Isaiah's predictive prophecy. Jesus didn't come because Isaiah predicted it. Jesus arrived and began doing the things that had been spoken of. And then it could be seen that, oh, he is the one that God has been promising all along. He made the people realise that this man is doing all the things God's promised to David and Abraham. That's why Jesus is always quoting those prophetic scriptures. Those ancient poems and prophetic stories basically created a giant sign which said, help wanted, Messiah needed. Yeah. And Jesus arrived and he applied for the job and he did it successfully. So Isaiah 1 to 39 includes all those beautiful poems that speak of the future coming of our Messiah, but how these promises were initially fulfilled actually surprised many people. And actually that's the second half of Isaiah, which begins to show us how it would begin to be fulfilled. So Isaiah always feels to us like it's written back to front, because all the great promises of that future Messiah king who will rule and will overcome everything and bring everything into reconciliation are at the beginning. And then the promises of the one that would be the suffering servant are in the second half. It feels back to front. And actually I found two articles and I read them. The other one, thought, hang on, that's back to front. And then I realised, of course, Isaiah's back to front. That's why it's so confusing. But all of it, all of Isaiah is there as the prophecy that shows us how God is going to fulfill his promises and speaks of Jesus. So let's just finish with that verse, that the thing that Jesus said, and then next time we'll have a look at the second half of Isaiah. Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets." I didn't come to do something new. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I'm not coming to do something you've not heard of. I'm coming to fulfill that which God, my Father, has been speaking about ever since man fell and was sent out of the garden. And this is our Jesus, the one who fulfills it all. And next time we'll look at the other half.